recorded button, so I will start the introduction shortly. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another series in our another episode in our CPD in 43 series. Today is Planning and Regeneration Update 2022. As many of you may remember, we did have a talk from the same speakers last year, and we had quite a lot of people asking this to be something that we do on an annual basis. So we've tried to make sure it's at the right time of year. So I think it's over a year since we had this talk. Just thank you again to Geraint and Sean for doing this from Savills. I'm going to hand it quite quickly straight over to them. As usual, please, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat box, and these will be fielded after our presentation. It's roughly going to be around about a 30-minute presentation, and I hope everyone has a number of questions to follow up. And without further ado, I will hand it straight over to Sean and Geraint.
Thanks, Isman. I'll just share the screen now. Just bear with. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Brilliant. Thanks, Isman. Geraint?
Brilliant. Thanks, Usman, and thanks, Joe, for inviting us back again. Delighted to be back presenting for you for today's CPD in 43 webinar. So I'm Geraint Jones. I'm a director in the planning team in Savills in Bristol. I've been with Savills for about 7 years now, but previously, so that's based out of Bristol for that period of time. Previously based out of the Cotswolds, but always been Southwest based. Sean, if you want to just give a brief overview.
Yeah, thanks, Geraint. So Sean Lewis, a senior planner in the Savills Bristol team, been here for 3.5 years, and like Geraint, really based myself throughout the Southwest throughout my career, spanning just shy of 10 years. So yeah, we'll crack on from there.
So just to give you a bit of an overview, Savills Bristol planning team. We've got a wide range of experience working on a range of projects, from small scale schemes comprising single dwellings, the Para 79 types, barn conversions for some of our agricultural colleagues, through to large scale urban regeneration and strategic projects up to delivery of new settlements. Since we presented to you last year, there's been no substantial changes in terms of national planning and guidance and legislation. But what we are seeing is some significant political changes and wider economic instability. And I think that's really influencing our day-to-day work. So we're going to touch on that. So Sean, if you want to give an overview of what we're going to cover today.
Sure. Thanks, Geraint. And as you can see on the screen there, so we're going to be covering 4 topics this afternoon, including a recap of the main points from last year's presentation, and the national level changes and the local implications that these will have on us. As Geraint's mentioned, there's not been a lot happening on that at the national level, but they will have local implications, which we'll cover those shortly. And we'll finally be providing an overview of more general planning matters to bear in mind when working in the Southwest, with a particular focus on ecology. I'll pass over to Geraint.
So in terms of the issues that we covered last year, in terms of use classes and the change that's come in there, I think we're all starting to become accustomed to those new uses. This slide's just a reminder of the retained, revoked and new or expanded use classes. It continues to remain really important to understand how the old use class interrelates to the current scheme, as existing sites and buildings often have been granted under the old regime, so understand how those two interrelate. Sean, if you just move on to the next slide. I think the thing that really jumps out of you here is this page shows it shows that summary, but it's Class E that really jumps out, and I think all of us were that was presented by central government as a real opportunity. Flexibility, particularly within retail centres. So for those of you who deal particularly with more retail-based scope, you would have thought there'd be lots more flexibility. But what we are finding is that councils are often limiting new permissions in terms of Class E. So we can talk about that if anyone's got specific questions. But as we covered it last year, we won't go through it again, but it's worth saying that the slides that we provided last year, we will recirculate so that you can see the full scope of that. Sean, if you just want to cover permitted development.
Okie dokes. So as part of the then government's agenda to boost the supply of homes, it brought in new PD rights relating to building upwards, residential redevelopment and changes of use. One of the more significant ones was Class MA, which was introduced to replace Class O to take account of the introduction of Class E in the updated use classes order. So with Class E, there are a number of requirements and restrictions, as with all PD rights. But one of the more key ones include the maximum floor space limit of 1,500 square meters, and the building must be in a qualifying use for at least 2 years. So the right excludes World Heritage sites. So you saw a lovely picture of Bath at the front of the presentation. We cannot exercise that right, Class MA in Bath, but so it excludes World Heritage sites and areas of outstanding natural beauty, but is available in conservation areas. So we in the Bristol office have looked at using the new use classes to inform site appraisals or feasibility studies into looking at the development potential for buildings and sites that accommodate commercial buildings on site. Recently, we obtained Class MA prior approval on a building near Trowbridge, so that formed part of a wider strategy for formal application to redevelop the wider site for new homes. So was more or less used as a fallback position, which we utilise and as I said, recently obtained permission. I think we obtained permission a couple of weeks ago. So it can be very, very helpful in some instances. As I said, these classes are subject to their own requirements and restrictions, and also require the council's written approval via the prior approval process. So it's a little bit more streamlined than the planning application route, but the council will still be assessing proposals against key core criteria, so relating to transport, flooding and drainage and contamination, etc. So that's just a reminder of the uses that we could utilise for permitted development, but we'd be happy to take any queries on that later on. So just moving on to the national level changes. So if you've not already heard, there has been significant change at the top of the government, and we're on to our third Prime Minister of the year. We entered the year with Boris, whose white paper reforms had stalled, and he changed the name of the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government to the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. He also had Michael Gove as his Community Secretary. So we'll take note of that. Liz Truss then obtained the power, and her sort of more radical economic policies included the creation of investment zones and reforms to housing and planning. These covered the potential removal of the national target to deliver 300,000 homes per annum, and scrapping the standard methodology, and even rumours of scrapping the 5-year housing land supply, which is currently being discussed in Parliament and in select committees as we speak. The replacement strategy was to look at population projections to set national housing targets, so resulting in the target being reduced by almost half of the 300,000 commitment. So the government the projections are looking at delivering around 160,000 new homes per year, which is significantly lower than the 300k, and it's not good news for those on the affordable housing waiting lists, those looking to buy those first-time buyers, but also those looking to move potentially into a new build, or even to move into a new home, and where families can free up space into new homes. So it wasn't looking good. But following Liz's brief stay in number 10, the public are all getting ready for Rishi, who has made very few comments on planning issues so far. But he has, however, reinstated Michael Gove as the new community secretary. So sort of going back to the original mandate, the levelling up agenda in England would appear to be back and will take the centre stage. I would watch the discussions regarding standard methodology and 5-year housing land supply, because Rishi may take those forward, and that's not the end of them. Geraint will touch on it very shortly, but as a result of Liz, we do have there is economic uncertainty. There's choppy waters on the horizon, but and this also has implications on property development and the planning sectors. I'll pass over to Geraint.
Thanks, Sean. So I think the sort of starting point of this is, I think probably most of us with our day-to-day jobs think, well, what does this actually mean for me? And it's the political influence is really important at a national level, but there's also the sort of wider economic influences that are impacting us all. And we've got the prospect of a significant recession, which has been potentially political analysts talking us into. We've had some real instability over the last few months, but even looking back periods much beyond that, with what's happening in the Ukraine still. So what I want to do is just talk about how that plays into local implications in our sort of day-to-day work. So I think the first thing to say is just to think about those economic implications. So we've got potential constraints for funding and lending, and that plays into two parts. So in terms of local authorities, there was already a significant constraint on budgets long before the most recent political upheaval, and that was meaning a lot of authorities were struggling to manage their overall budgets, and planning teams were unfortunately one of the areas that are impacted, because their key focus is primarily, and the key funding is primarily on healthcare and wider care in the community. That's when we speak to chief executives of councils, that is their focus. The fees that we all pay for planning applications are not ring fenced, and so we can't guarantee by paying planning application fees or planning performance agreements, additional ways of funding planning applications. We can't guarantee that money's going to end up where it needs to be. So that means for councils, there's existing problems in terms of how they resource the planning side of their responsibilities. Looking at it from a client perspective, there's obviously certain clients who are directly impacted because they rely on effectively mortgage funding, and so what's happened to them is the rates have significantly gone up, and they can't be as competitive in the market. So one thing that we look at internally when we're looking at business generation is, where do you focus yourself? And I think it's a good lesson for us all just to reflect on who is going to continue to be active in those difficult markets. So if you're looking at existing significant landowners, landholding estates, or individuals with net worth, people who are not reliant on sourcing money elsewhere, it's a good sense check for us all just to think about where you go. But in terms of practical things and who's competing for sites, we're seeing one of the most significant implications is not necessarily the cost of money going up, but building costs, and that's been rising for a long time. And we're seeing, and I'm sure you all are too, people who are paying 50% plus, 100% plus in some cases, on top of that, what they might have been paying for building costs and labour maybe a couple of years ago. And that is all playing through into the system on what people are capable of offering for sites and capable of delivering. So in terms of that detailed approach. We've got to think in terms of design, but also in planning. What can we do to minimise those impacts, to make those sites deliverable, and yet at the same end, planning continues to add costs to every project, and Sean's going to come on and talk to some of those later on. And finally, I just thought it's just worth revisiting the availability of skilled labour continues to be a constraint on delivery, significantly impacted by Brexit and loss of people within the workplace who moved away from the UK following Brexit. And so delivery continues to be challenging. So if we just move on to the next slide, Sean, I'm going to talk through sort of planning implications. So what's happening at the moment, and I think the instability at the top, the most obvious thing for people like Sean and I is that plan making is to a large degree, or for a large degree of authorities, is on hold, and that's either happening just because there's so much uncertainty about the numbers that local authorities are likely to need to deliver, but also it's things like, for instance, Somerset and the authorities that will be merging there. And so until that merger happens, the councils are taking the view there's no point in them unilaterally moving forward as those smaller authorities. They may as well wait until Somerset's in place. So these things are meaning that there's a delay in planning authorities bringing forward plan making, which gives certainty to the bigger sites. What that means for those of you involved with residential is a lot of them aren't achieving their housing land supplies. So irrespective of any other constraints, the lack of certainty about where they should be allocating the big sites means that a lot of them don't have a 5-year housing land supply, and that will add to the weight of your application. If you're bringing forward housing, then that should weigh in your favour when you're putting your application in. So the next year or two for a lot of authorities, it's worth just double checking what the position is in terms of plan making if you're putting in a residential scheme, because I think there's a real argument to be had there, and even if the councils and their politicians won't accept that, the weight that should be applied to that, if you follow through to appeal, inspectors will. Just picking up on local authority resourcing, mentioned about the difficulties that a lot of authorities are having. We're finding that a lot of councils are under-resourced. Bristol City Council, because of the financial constraints, have a control on additional recruitment. So even if they know they need to and want to, they can't recruit additional. So some authorities are turning to agency staff and looking to planning consultancies to provide additional agency. But the base end result is that the resourcing to deal with your planning applications is much reduced, and that's pretty much every authority across the country. That means for us that we've got to be clever about how we approach planning applications. What we did for some time was look at things like one, making sure our pre-application process was robust, but also looking at things like PPAs, which are planning performance agreements, where you could agree to pay a certain sum of additional money on top of your application fee to help with the resourcing within the council. And so a lot of our larger clients were seeing that as a better way to go than to sit there for the long term waiting for the applications to be dealt with. And at the time, they'd be just accruing costs because they paid money out on a site and they were paying interest rates on that loan. So they were happy to pay a fee to the council to move things forward. And we found some success with that, but we're finding now that councils are so under-resourced and they're struggling to get agency staff in as well, that just the resource isn't there, even if you're willing to pay additional. So what we would suggest is when you're going in to put a planning application in, if you normally do pre-app, just have a really good look at what those pre-application timescales are looking like. Are you going to put in a pre-app, which is, is always best practice, but if it means you're going to be sat there for 6 to 8 months waiting for a response, actually the better thing for the client is to submit the planning application and force the timeline that way. So it's one for you to consider on a site-by-site basis and on an authority-by-authority basis, but don't automatically go to the case of pre-application. Have that conversation with your client and think about what's going to deliver the best timescales for them. If we can move on to the next slide, Sean. just going to touch on here, this is just going back to the high level implications, what's happening in terms of housing numbers. And I think 300,000 is the target that we've all been aiming for since early 2000s, but never actually getting there. But the planning consents had been ramped up. So the government were recognising the need to be letting more through the planning system. You can see there since, well, probably the last 7 years or so, the numbers of planning consents have been pushing up over 300,000. But yet the deliveries remained below 250,000, which was still much better than we'd seen for quite some time. But they have started to drop off, and so you can see the COVID drop, but they had recovered. But the economic instability that we've got was impacting things dropping off, but also thinking more significantly about that plan making point that I was raising. You can see that that last sort of year and a half, 2 years, that's fundamentally down to plan making not delivering on those really big sites. So that goes back to the point that will play through into housing numbers. The other thing that I probably would say to caveat that is that we're seeing that still there's a lot of developers looking for land. So while there is economic uncertainty out there, those particularly the big house builders, they've got expectations to have a certain level of throughput per year, and a number of them are struggling to get control of enough sites because of the plan making situation. So I think the market actually has a degree of robustness to it, even if there's economic difficulty over the short term. I don't expect anything in the medium to long term to change. We're still going to be looking at trying to push those numbers up to sort of 250,000 mark. I expect that to be maintained because of the people in the market and what they're trying to achieve. But whether we get anywhere beyond that will be dependent on whether the authorities continue to engage, well, or start re-engaging with the plan system, and where the central government continues to ask us to push for that higher figure that we'd historically been targeting. So I think for now, I can come back and expand on that in more detail if anyone's got specific questions, but we can go to some of the general planning matters that are impacting us day to day.
Thanks, Geraint. And as I said earlier, we'll be focusing these points on more or less on ecological considerations. So firstly, with biodiversity net gain. So it's always been around delivering net gains to biodiversity, but the formal legal concept of biodiversity net gain, or BNG, was introduced through the Environment Act in November 2021. The Act sets a requirement for most development proposals to deliver a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain. We're currently within the transitionary phase of the Act taking effect, and the legal requirement for 10% BNG will be enforceable from November 2023. Just be aware, though, that some local authorities may already specify a requirement for net gains to biodiversity. South Gloss comes to my mind, and also a figure for BNG may be specified as well in local policy. So something for you to consider. That may be in policy, or that may be the figure may be in guidance, providing an additional explanation to the adopted ecology policies.
It's worth just saying on that as well, we're finding that a number of the ecologists within local authorities are being difficult in negotiating that point. So always think about what your fallback is and what the timeline is linked to that fallback. So if a council doesn't have a percentage in place, but they'd like to move towards one, and you've got an ecology officer that's been particularly difficult and saying they want to see a better uplift than you think is required by policy, and you've got a weak planning officer who isn't willing to go against their ecology team, just think actually moving to the alternative. What you do, you could push that through an appeal process, but that might put your client to 8 to 12 months delays. So how hard you argue that depends on how willing you are to go to those fallback positions. Sorry, Sean.
That's okay. So there are very few exemptions to providing BNG, and these may be schemes that you are involved in. So they include extensions, householder applications, and schemes falling under permitted development rights. We've been advised that smaller single dwelling schemes and above can qualify for BNG, although it may be prudent in some circumstances to possibly take the risk and wait for the ecology officers to raise it. But in the first instance, as is said at the bottom there, we would always ensure that you seek ecology advice if you're unsure of the regs. Particularly the legislation is quite confusing at the moment, and the devil is in the detail, as always, and especially with BNG, and consultants and the sector are all waiting for secondary legislation to specify things like exemptions and the BNG metrics. So it's which metric to use, that is. So BNG is assessed using these metrics, and there's a metric for large sites, so that's just the general one, but there's also a metric for small sites of less than 10 units, which can be completed by the layperson. However, because this has been designed for non-ecologists, it assumes higher ecological values for biodiversity features, such as, say, grassland. And it assumes a higher ecological impact for smaller development. Even if you were to tick the box which says grassland, it might be a specific type that is a higher quality, and therefore you're having to make up the ecological the BNG benefits via other ways. Ultimately, get an ecologist to complete the metric for you. I would note that installing bird and bat boxes doesn't count towards the BNG score, but street trees are quite easy gains. So I would always, as I said, seek advice if you're unsure. In regard to clearing sites, so the general advice is not to clear sites until your ecology consultant has taken a look and also assessed the baseline conditions of it. Ecology consultants and local authorities can look back before, I think, January 2020, and they can look at aerial photos of the site and what it looked like. So I would advise instructing consultants as early as possible. Is there anything else, Geraint? Did you want to add anything into that?
No, I'm sure the questions will go into detail, so let's leave it to that.
Thank you, Dix. So I was going to say, just very quickly, when the legislation kicks in, every scheme will be able to offsite either on or offsite, offset, on or offsite. Our ecology consultants think that the 50% of their current instructions and applications will need to be offset in the ecological impacts, so it will become the norm. So if we move on to nutrient neutrality, can't see, there you go. I was just worrying there, the image wasn't up. So some of us have heard of it, but what is it? Nutrient neutrality. It's a process called eutrophication, and put it simply, it's the result of excessive amounts of nitrates or phosphates polluting the local water network, which impacts ecologically sensitive areas. So as on the screen there, your SACs, your SPARs, your Ramsar sites. Phosphates and nitrates enter the river systems as a result of poor quality sewage treatment outputs, and/or agricultural land practices. It's house building and development that involves an overnight stay, however, which is being asked to pick up the tab. The impacts of this are significant, and it has in some areas resulted in a complete moratorium on development. The image you can see on your screen there shows that there are 74 local planning authorities across England that are currently affected by this issue, and 50 to 70% of homes planned in these areas could be at risk of falling by the wayside. So it is quite a significant implication. As you can see there, increased delays and costs at all stages compared to what we've just discussed. It's not good news, and it's a really troubling thing that's going around at the moment, especially in the southwest.
Just to cut in on that, in terms of thinking about sort of constraints and opportunities, we were talking to Usman earlier and saying where there's challenges, there are opportunities always. And I think the one thing that we're finding, those areas that are constrained by this, it might not be the whole authority area, because obviously they're looking at sort of catchments. So if you're involved in an area that's impacted by this, it's really important to try and understand where the line of the catchments are that are impacted, because if you've got a site that sits outside of that, that means you're in an authority that's struggling to meet its housing numbers probably anyway, really hampered by nutrient neutrality and trying to find solutions for that. So if you've got a piece of land that sits in that authority outside of those areas, then the need to deliver housing weighs even more greatly in your favour. So worth understanding that, because that would support your application.
Off the back of what Geraint said there, are the slides from the previous presentation to SEAT include a map of the Somerset, Levels and Moors Ramsar catchment area. That's not a definitive boundary. No boundary is definitive in respect of nutrient neutrality, but gives a good indication of which sites will be caught by this. So it is a significant challenge, but there are opportunities, as Geraint said. But nonetheless, at appeal, if this was to get to planning appeal, very few inspectors are going to go against the advice of Natural England. So it's a tricky one. There are some areas that are resolving it, but there are some areas like Cornwall that has probably spent a good year with the nutrient neutrality issue and is still trying to resolve itself. So there are solutions to it, although quite large scale, but there are opportunities as well. This is a very current issue, and in the event that you or your clients may be affected by the issue, particularly the phosphates issue in Somerset, we can help. And that generally concludes the presentation. But thank you very much for joining, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Geraint and Sean. So we'll just dive straight into the questions. By the way, everyone, if you do have any questions, please do add them to the chat box and we can field them. But I'll start from the top and I'll work my way through. So we've got a question in from John. Thrust to develop regional development plans is causing confusion to future LDP development. In Wales, phosphate issues are also significantly restricting development and LDP responses. Is there any commentary to offer regarding employment site development and appetite?
Sorry, can you explain it without reading it? That was quite a difficult question to follow.
So if I break it down then, so thrust to develop regional development plans is causing confusion to future LDP development. And then second part is, in Wales, phosphate issues are also significantly restricting development and LDP responses, etc. So I think it's almost, I guess it's almost 3 questions in one, and then I have stopped and not mentioned the last bit, which is split into a separate chat box.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as we said, there's constraints to bringing forward local development plans, but I think that will resolve itself. I think the difficulty is at the moment that we've got a gap where there's a lack of certainty at a national level. There is sort of aspirations to sort of bring back in sort of a regional level of organisation, but what we found in the southwest, I think it probably it gives you an indication without formally bringing back a regional layer of government how difficult that is, because trying to get authorities who might have different ambitions to work together means we've seen several plans where they've tried to have an overarching position on housing numbers and other things fall away because they just can't get agreement and they just can't get a sensible evidence base together that they all agree on. So we're finding here now we've got Baines, North Somerset, Bristol and South Gloss having to go their own ways. There's still some communication and they're still trying to work together with a broad evidence base, but they can't reach fundamental agreement on the politics at a top level. So regional, I think, is unlikely to come back in any significant way. Does that answer the question? I wasn't entirely clear what the question was trying to point out.
No problem. I believe so. I think it's a if John would like sort of to add further down, then please do. And then he goes on to sort of say, is there any commentary to offer regarding employment site development and any appetite on that matter?
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, so for context, nitrates and phosphates largely affect, and the issue largely affects proposals which involve an overnight stay. So as well as your residential, your hotel, and some of your tourism development in the southwest. So in a pure sense, like employment and looking at this conventionally, employment proposals and commercial proposals do not require that. So I do not consider that they would be caught by this, but we can double check that.
I wonder whether, it depends when that question came in. If it came in when I was talking more generally about high level issues, then I'd say that the employment continues. It's had a very, very strong year again. And I think what we're seeing is that maybe some of the heat in terms of land values is being taken out of that market, but that's more those organisations that were reliant on significant loans to fund their business model. The long-term players, so the players who tend to build out and retain property, so the likes of St Modwin and others, they are continuing to be active in the market. They're just trying to make sure that the deals appropriately represent or appropriately reflect things like the sort of the build out costs, which is fluctuating at such a speed that's quite difficult because you're having to go and renegotiate with landowners. But I would say in terms of the marketplace, there's still appetite for employment at all levels, but there's that real big box level that we deal with quite a bit of is really still quite prominent. And the most notable thing that we're seeing is at a national level, our economic team are engaging with our employment agency colleagues with high levels of government, and that is filtering through into employment having a higher profile in national policy and legislation than it once did. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with something, a lot of the local authorities historically would have been delivering employment based on a link to the housing numbers, and then there'd be a percentage, it would have a floor space that would tie into the amount of additional houses. Now what they're starting to look at is actually, have they just been under providing employment for a long time? And are there lots of other things that play into the delivery of employment needs that should be looked at? So that change in model that we've all seen with people moving away from the high street and engaging with online more, that was happening before COVID, but COVID accelerated it. We're seeing acceptance from a lot of local authorities that that's important, and with the constraints of the high street, actually the jobs that would bring with it are very welcome.
Great. We've got a question from Neil. Will BNG apply to change of use? Apologies if you're not too sure what the acronym is.
Yeah, I think this. Sean will want to come in on this as well, but the critical thing is what you're applying for. So if the application is for something that introduces overnight stays, so you're introducing residential into an existing in building. So it's a change of use application, but it's introducing overnight stays, then I believe that's court. But Sean, do you want to comment on?
I'll go back and double check that in terms of changing use. Geraint, I think you talk about nutrient neutrality in terms of the overnight stays, but the BNG point principle, it still applies. If you're changing the use of a building, then technically you're not. You may be undertaking some external works, for example, to the building, or potentially for parking and refuse. And servicing and maintenance entrances and access and egress. So we will double check that position in terms of change of use, but my hunch is that it would not get caught.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I'm sorry, I was talking at cross purposes with the nutrient neutrality fresh in my mind, but yeah, I think BNG would only get caught if you're dealing with if your change of use had external elements to it. So there was something that required some physical changes externally, and they formed part of a wider change of use application, as Sean set out.
Yeah, just for everyone's benefit, that was biodiversity net gain. Graham, question in from Graham. What if any is the formal process for additional fees to expedite the planning process, and would this be an option for domestic private client projects?
It is an option at all scales. It just depends on council's willingness and ability to engage with it. So you have your standard planning application fees, which are set nationally. And we find that for most householder applications in particular, they're not enough to cover the resources that are required to determine those applications. So that's a challenge for local authority. Most of the schemes we deal with are slightly larger scale, and in those cases, often councils will engage with us in terms of additional fees. So what you typically do to secure those, well, there's two ways of giving the council additional fees. One is their pre-app process, so you're effectively doubling up on your time with local authorities, and the pre-app fees, depending on the authorities, because the pre-app fees they set themselves. As opposed to a national level of funding being set. So in that circumstance, some councils have extortionate pre-app fees, and so they might welcome you engaging with that way, because it's a way of their planning department securing additional funds. So there's that route. Or more broadly, in terms of your general engagement on a pre-app and or planning application process, you can have what's known as a PPA, so that's a planning performance agreement. Some authorities engage with these extensively, others less so. And what they do is you're agreeing a contribution, and that would have a structure of timelines to it, of things that you're all agreeing to achieve, and that's on both sides, what you would submit and by what time, but what also the council's determination process is what they will agree to do for that additional funding. So you're sort of doubling up on a planning application fee effectively, but if it gives you certainty of timeline, then it's definitely worth doing. I think the problem we're finding at the moment is some of the councils, and we've had it recently, where they've said, historically we've done them, but we know we don't have the resources to do them, so there's no point in us engaging with you because you'll never pay us that money because we won't achieve the deadlines. So I think the answer is it's down to the council whether they want to open that opportunity. And what you've got to think carefully about is in the PPAs, the original ones that came through, you were just effectively paying money to secure a timeline. What you need to think about now is there actually an additional resource you can help fund tied to your application? Some councils are acute to this and have agencies lined up, and they effectively get a quote from the agency, and the agency says this is what it would cover for us to act as the planning officer and take some of the weight off your shoulders for this application. And if the client meets that, if the applicant meets that fee, then they can be brought in to do that work for them. But it's worth speaking to the councils whether they've got those things in place, and each individual council is going to be different.
Yeah, I was gonna just jump in there quickly, Geraint, and just say that that sort of information that you can find out, as Geraint said, through speaking with the council duty planning officer, but also at the agents forums. Most local authorities host those. I know they do in Bristol and North Somerset and Baines as well. Yeah, worth getting in touch with the council.
Yeah, and I know I had a meeting with Bath with Baines' sort of lead on planning not so long ago, and they were saying these are areas that they hadn't engaged with significantly to date, but were actively exploring. So if you've got suggestions about how that could be put in place, take them to your local authority, take them to the planning team, because they're looking for solutions.
Great. There's a question in from Sarah. Has there been any indication when the secondary legislation will be published? Presume that was for the biodiversity net gain?
Yeah, so good question. So there was a consultation out earlier this year in regard to the secondary legislation. I think that was in January, February this year. And not to my knowledge, there's any indication given the changes. I think there's a few sort of things that they've got to get out the way first. A few interim matters that Rishi's got to deal with. With Michael Gove, who's now on the as the community secretary, I can imagine that discussion kickstarting. Bearing in also mind he was the environment secretary before he became community secretary for Boris. So don't have a timescale, but I can imagine early next year, possibly as a guess.
Great. And then I'm going to try and amalgamate. There's a couple of points from John where he's highlighting that there's similar issues regarding nitrates in Wales, and it's also causing similar issues regarding their regional development plans, etc. And I do remember doing some reading about this quite some time back, and it's not actually just an England issue. It's not just a Wales issue. It's actually a worldwide issue. Certain governments are getting through this in one way or another, and everyone's sort of developing plans. So I do know that this is almost a international issue rather than a local one, and obviously dependent on the size and the abilities within each and every government. Things are happening at different speeds. But if you guys can obviously fill in on that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to jump in. So yeah, fully aware it's an issue in Wales, but as you say, it's been an international one. The case arose from what we call the Dutch nitrogen case in the Netherlands, and I think that affected a European protected site. So yeah, fully aware that this is far wider than the Southwest. In terms of the solutions for the River Wye and the corridor and the SAC, there are some quite innovative solutions being banded around. So, for example, the use of anaerobic digesters, which might facilitate in reducing the amount of fertilizers seeping through to watercourses. Appreciate they're expensive bits of kit, but if a client has a bit of land and gets some help, some funding help from some very interested house builders in the area, then that could be a solution. So aware of that it's wider than the Southwest.
Yeah,
Great.
Some interesting solutions coming forward. As Sean says, I've seen some one site in Wales in particular I know of where there's a wider agricultural ownership which surrounds wastewater treatment works. So they've got an area of land between the treatment works and the nearest drainage channel that it would normally flow into. And so the ability to do something with that land in terms of technical solution, looking at things like reed beds and other solutions that could go in there. So whereas on your development site, it might not be easy to achieve things there, but if you can get land controls, particularly in areas like that where you can intercept existing significant harmful flows and resolve those, you're effectively able to buy credits for your site. So in the same way as BNG is set up, so that you the intention is long term that there will be BNG credits that you might be able to just access if you can't deliver them on your own site. You can effectively, someone else delivers them, and we've got lots of landowners, land-owning estates within Savills that we act for, who are looking at this very carefully, and areas of land that might not have significant agricultural potential, but they control, they can deliver biodiversity enhancements there through a scheme that's approved, and then effectively sell those credits back as people come forward with development. And I'm sure there'll be similar proposals for biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, off the back of that, just
so I meant nutrient neutrality. I keep confusing the two.
Off the back of that, it's just a plug to say that Savills has an environmental exchange. So if you do have clients with land, with extensive tracts of land, it would be worth getting in touch, because you can take advantage of those offsetting benefits and impacts of development, as Geraint mentioned. So we're looking at potentially offsetting potential nutrient neutrality depending on the area that it's located, of course, but also in regard to the offsetting impacts, BNG impacts.
Great. And then I'll ask a couple of questions just before we bring it to a close. So one is, there have been extensive issues in regards to resourcing and general abilities from the local authorities. For example, last year we had an issue where Gloucestershire Council had a cyber attack and their entire system was brought down. We had a number of local authorities who are suffering from, which I think Geraint mentioned particularly earlier, suffering from a resourcing issue. And then also as well, it's the specific, sort of taking that slightly further, is the specific issue in regards to the expertise on particular consultees that we have issues as well. We're noticing that, as mentioned, there's the need for them to sort of port out and request specialist involvement, and that's obviously taking time. And then response times are, I mean, following the changes during the pandemic and working from home, it's very difficult to actually get someone to come and visit site and so on. So it just seems like there's a whole ball of things that are outside of the single person's control. It seems like things are moving in a direction, and I hope that we find the ground at some point, but just see if you guys have any commentary to sort of add to those points.
I think the thing that really frustrates me is that the planning system should be able to fund itself, but because it's not ring fenced, that money, lots of that money will disappear into other areas of the council. So the only way at the moment that we can deal with that in the short term is trying to find other ways of funding it, and that unfortunately means it falls on the shoulders of the applicant, because either at local or national level there's no appetite to put additional funds into planning, so we have to resource them ourselves. But in the absence of appropriate resources in-house, and you're right, it's not just the planning department, it's everybody that feeds into the planning system. So we've got lots of examples of shortage of ecologists, landscapers, urban designers. Lots of who've gone in recent years have gone external to the public sector to look for alternative opportunities. So I think we probably the system will try, the wider planning industry will have to find a way of resourcing the councils and provide them with that specialist help. And I think it will be a lot of external consultants having to be brought in. And a lot of consultants are setting themselves up to do that. We're finding some examples where consultancies that are set up to do this exact thing and maybe provide a planning officer service for councils who are short-staffed are going and taking staff out of local authorities, offering them slightly better salaries, and then selling them back into local authorities at a higher rate. It's perverse, but quite a successful business model by all accounts. But I think it's those things are frustrating, but I think that is the way we are heading.
Okay, great. And then probably my second one, and obviously I could go on, but I'll just keep it to just two questions. before we bring it to a close. So second one is one thing that we've at the coalface from our perspective. One thing that we've noticed is there's a renewed requirement and emphasis on drainage. So we've noticed during applications, surface water, particularly, as well as foul water, etc., has become a sort of major issue that needs to be resolved during the application process rather than something that is looked into at a later stage. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that situation as well, because it doesn't feel like all the information is to hand for either side.
Yeah, I think it depends what area you're dealing with, because we've got a particular issue. I mean, it's a nationwide issue in terms of flood risk, but we're finding that you know, within the centre of Bristol, the concerns about what could happen if you project 100 years into the future when you're looking at residential schemes. The Environment Agency will show no flexibility, and that's a particular circumstance because the council don't yet have in place a full strategy for how they're going to deal with the water level rise that's coming. And in somewhere like Bristol, where you're looking 100 years ahead, what you've got to assess is that worst case, where you've got not only what's the worst case in terms of significant rainfall, but you're also looking at your spring tides as well. And the two things merging, and we've got sites that theoretically in 100 years in those extreme events could be under 2 meters of water. Now we all know the reality is that pretty much most of Bristol city centre would be underwater at that point. So the solution is that the council have to come up with a citywide strategy, and they are doing that. But until the EA have confidence that's in place, the EA are constraining development. That's slowly relaxing as the city council move forward with their strategy and certainty of funding. But that's a significant issue. But I think that's just a glimpse as to people like the EA really holding their line in a planning process. And it's immensely frustrating because we know those sites wouldn't flood even in the extreme events for the next 30 to 40 years. So, of course, the council is going to have a solution in place by then, but they're frustrating development coming forward. Also worth saying that in those circumstances, we're being made to deliver a design of development where you're having no active floor space below that. I think it was is about 1.8 meters on that particular building. So the ground level of for any notable active uses is 1.8 meters up in the air, and you lose your design response to the street scene at that point. So yeah, I think the statutory bodies are really flexing their muscles against weak local planning authorities. I don't know if you wanted to add.
No, yeah. I was just going to jump in. I absolutely agree with that. We've got a proposal in South Gloucester, and I agree with Geraint. It does depend where you are and what officers you're dealing with, and I'm sure your members have experienced this many a time where we are being required to submit much more information than is required at the planning application stage during the determination than what can be supplied via planning conditions. And in that instance, some local authorities just want the reassurance that we're providing something that is robust and deliverable, and that we've considered the wider implications of the development. So yeah, it's something that's crept in over the last 3 to 5 years as local authorities have become a little bit weaker.
I think it's just worth, as I said earlier, think about what your fallback position is when you're going to negotiate on those kind of things. It might feel unreasonable. You might be able to write a very convincing case as to why you shouldn't provide it at this stage. But if it's not going to persuade the officers and the consultees, are you willing to go to appeal on it and take all the timeline? You might well have a robust position. That doesn't mean it's in the best interest of the council, of your client, to pursue it. So just think carefully about what the end game is.
Great, thank you guys. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Geraint and Sean again for returning for the planning and regeneration update. I hope you all really enjoyed that and also managed to pick up quite a lot of really detailed elements in regard to planning. As mentioned throughout the talk, there was a talk last year which I've shared the link on the chat box, but we will also, following this talk, we will send out an email to all attendees with a copy of last year's talk as well as this year's talk, and also the video will be uploaded to YouTube shortly, so there will be both the talks, previous year and this year, up online very shortly. So please do have a look and read through that. Obviously, if you do have any specific queries that you'd like to raise from a planning perspective, please do get in touch with Geraint and Sean directly. They're more than happy to field those queries, and then obviously if it's for a specialist colleague of theirs, they can obviously pass that on. Just to give you a highlight of our upcoming talks, we only have 2 left for the year. So we have a poster for this one, not for the next one, but we have a poster for our following talk, which is on Wednesday, 23rd of November, which is from Darren Evans, Achieving Net Zero Carbon in Construction. So please do sign up for that. That is live on Eventbrite. Our subsequent one to that, which will be our final one for the year, which is on the 7th of December, which is from Autodesk SpaceMaker, really interesting urban design tool that's been developed in the Nordic region, which is now being taken over by Autodesk and will be available, I presume is available already, and we'll learn more about that on the 7th of December. Really interesting piece of software and can help create a lot of design concept stage to understand how the massing, etc., can work. So that's it from us. Thank you again to Geraint and Sean, and I look forward to seeing you all at our subsequent talks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.